Today was supposed to be the moment Red Bull showed its dominance again. First race weekend of the 2026 Formula 1 season. First real laps in Australia. First chance for Max Verstappen to prove the new RB22 was ready. But something shocking happened instead. In the middle of practice, Verstappen's Red Bull suddenly stopped in the pit lane. Minutes later, he spun through the gravel and damaged the floor of the car. And by the end of the session, the reigning champion was only 6th fastest, behind Ferrari, Mercedes, and McLaren. For Red Bull, that almost never happens. But the real story started after the session. Because team boss Laurent Mekies revealed something about the RB22 that changed how engineers inside the paddock are interpreting those results. According to Mekies, what we saw on Friday might be completely misleading. Because the RB22 could still be hiding a much higher performance ceiling. In other words, Red Bull might not be slow. They might simply not have unlocked the car yet. And here is the crazy part. Even with a broken session, lost track time, and damage to the floor, Verstappen was still less than 7/10 away from the fastest lap of the day. Which raises a very uncomfortable question for the rest of the grid. If that was Red Bull on a bad day, what happens when the RB22 finally runs a clean session? Because there is one technical detail about the new Red Bull Ford power unit that could completely change this championship. And almost nobody noticed it during practice today. So let's break down exactly what happened to Verstappen and the RB22 in Australia. The moment free practice 1 began in Melbourne, the atmosphere around Red Bull felt different. For the first time in years, the team was entering a new era with a completely different engine philosophy. The RB22 is not just another evolution of previous Red Bull cars. It is the first machine fully designed around the brand new Red Bull Ford power unit. A project that represents one of the biggest technical risks the team has ever taken. For more than a decade, Red Bull relied on Honda technology. Now the responsibility belongs entirely to Red Bull powertrains, working together with Ford. That means a new hybrid system, new electrical deployment strategies, and a completely new way of integrating the engine with the chassis. Naturally, that kind of change creates enormous pressure. Because in modern Formula 1, the power unit does far more than simply produce horsepower. It controls energy recovery, battery deployment, thermal efficiency, and even how the car behaves during acceleration. If the integration between the engine and the aerodynamic platform is not perfect, the entire package can lose performance. That is why many engineers were watching the RB22 very carefully when it first appeared on track at Albert Park. Visually, the car looked extremely compact. The bodywork around the side pods was tight. The airflow management around the floor looked incredibly complex. Red Bull had clearly designed the car to maximize aerodynamic efficiency. But the real question was simple. Would the new Ford power unit deliver the performance needed to fight Ferrari and Mercedes? During the first session, the early signs were not dramatic. But they were interesting. Ferrari immediately looked strong. Charles Leclerc placed the SF26 at the top of the timing sheet. Lewis Hamilton followed very closely in the second Ferrari. But Max Verstappen stayed within reach. He finished the session in 3rd position, only a few tenths away from the leaders. At that moment, the picture looked fairly normal. Ferrari quick. Red Bull competitive. Mercedes and McLaren somewhere in the mix. But some analysts noticed something subtle about the RB22. The car did not look as comfortable as previous Red Bulls through the fastest corners. The front end seemed precise. But the rear of the car occasionally looked slightly nervous when Verstappen applied the throttle. That observation alone did not mean much. Practice sessions are full of experimental setups. Teams constantly adjust ride heights, wing levels, and suspension settings. But it hinted at something important. The RB22 might have a narrower operating window than the dominant Red Bulls of previous seasons. And if that was true, it could explain why Verstappen himself sounded cautious before arriving in Australia. He had already warned that the RB22 might not be the fastest car on the grid right now. A very unusual statement from a driver who spent years dominating Formula One. Still, the real drama of the day had not happened yet. Because when Free Practice 2 began, the entire Red Bull program suddenly fell apart. Just minutes after leaving the garage, Verstappen's car lost power and stopped at the exit of the pit lane. The RB22 had to be pushed back by the mechanics while engineers searched for the cause. More than 20 minutes of the session disappeared. And that kind of lost time on a Friday is extremely damaging. Because those minutes are usually used for qualifying simulations and race pace runs. Without that data, preparing the car for Saturday becomes much more difficult. But when Verstappen finally returned to the track, the situation became even worse. During a fast lap attempt, the rear of the RB22 snapped violently through one of Albert Park's quick sections. The car slid across the grass and into the gravel trap. The impact damaged the floor, sending fragments of carbon fiber flying as the car bounced through the gravel. From that moment on, the rest of the session became almost meaningless. Because once the floor is damaged, the aerodynamic balance of the car changes completely. The RB22 was no longer showing its real performance. And that is exactly why Laurent Mekies' comments after the session became so important. Because according to the Red Bull boss, Friday's results may not reflect the true pace of the RB22 at all. Which raises a fascinating possibility. What if Red Bull's difficult Friday in Melbourne is hiding something much bigger? Because there is one specific aspect of the RB22 that could become incredibly dangerous once the team fully understands it. But the real reason Laurent Mekies' comments changed the conversation in the paddock comes down to one very simple idea. Red Bull may not be slow. Red Bull may simply be early in the learning process. And that distinction is extremely important. Because the RB22 is one of the most radical design resets the team has attempted in years. This car was not built as a small evolution. It was built as the foundation for the completely new regulation era of 2026. New chassis philosophy. New suspension layout. And most importantly, a brand new power unit partnership with Ford. That kind of project takes time to mature. Even for a team as efficient as Red Bull. Inside the RB22, everything revolves around one objective. Efficiency. Aerodynamic efficiency. Energy efficiency. Thermal efficiency. The car was designed to extract as much performance as possible from the new hybrid rules. But those same hybrid rules make the system incredibly complex. Drivers are now relying more heavily than ever on electrical deployment during acceleration phases. If the battery deployment is not perfectly calibrated, if the energy recovery system is slightly misaligned with the engine torque curve, the driver immediately feels it when exiting corners. That could explain something analysts noticed during Verstappen's runs. The RB22 looked fast through certain sections of the track, but slightly unpredictable in others. Almost like the car was still searching for the perfect balance between mechanical grip and electrical deployment. And when that balance is not perfect, drivers must adapt their driving style. Sometimes lifting earlier. Sometimes applying the throttle more carefully. Which costs time. That may also explain why Verstappen sounded unusually cautious when speaking about the RB22 before the weekend began. He openly admitted that the car might not be the fastest machine on the grid right now. That statement surprised many fans. But after the first day in Australia, his words suddenly make much more sense. Because Friday exposed two different realities at the same time. On one side, Red Bull struggled operationally. The pit lane stoppage. The lost track time. The damage to the floor. All of those factors prevented the team from completing its normal program. But on the other side, something else remained visible. Even during a chaotic session, Verstappen still managed to stay surprisingly close to the front. Less than 7/10 away from the fastest lap of the day. And that was without a clean run. Without a perfect setup. Without a fully intact floor. That detail is exactly why Mekies sounded so calm after the session. Because internally, Red Bull may believe the real pace of the RB22 has not appeared yet. And if that is true, the rest of the grid may need to be careful. Ferrari looked extremely strong on Friday. Mercedes showed impressive consistency. McLaren even finished the day on top with Oscar Piastri. But Red Bull has built its reputation on something very specific: development speed. Few teams in Formula One improve a car faster once the season begins. And if the RB22 truly has a higher performance ceiling than what we saw today, then the difficult Friday in Melbourne might only be the beginning of a much larger story. Because if Red Bull solves the operational issues overnight, if the engineers repair the damaged floor and refine the setup, and if Verstappen finally gets a clean qualifying simulation, the competitive order we saw today could suddenly change. Which leads to the biggest question after the first day of the 2026 season. Did Ferrari, Mercedes, and McLaren really gain the upper hand? Or did Red Bull simply hide its real pace behind a chaotic Friday in Australia?